That was the first thing I noticed about the Galactic Council's main docking bay. Not the 3 moons hanging in the viewport like they had nowhere else to be. Not the 11 atmospheric processors running at once, turning the air into something that smelled like a flower shop and an auto repair garage had agreed to share the same square kilometer. Not even the fact that I was standing in a space so large that the far walls were a soft blur, holding a carry-on bag with one broken wheel and a duffel bag that had already left a bruise on my shoulder during the walk from the shuttle. No, it was the tile. One floor tile about 6 meters to my left was a slightly different shade from every other one around it. Not damaged, not cracked, just substituted. Whoever had laid this floor had run short of the original material halfway through and found something close enough that most visitors would never stop to notice. I noticed. I dragged my carry-on over and stood on it. My orientation handler, Isath, stopped walking. He was a Veldry, which meant he communicated partly through the broad ridged neck frills that ran from behind his jaw to his collarbone. Right now, those frills were cycling from amber to orange. Amber meant, please pay attention. Orange meant, I am confused and this is making me uncomfortable. Delegate Voss, he said through the translation collar at his throat, is there a problem with this section of the floor? No, I said. I just like it. He looked at me. He looked at the tile. He looked at me again. Then he turned and continued the tour. My name is Mara Voss. I am 29 years old. I have a graduate degree in xenolinguistics that cost more than my parents' house, a carry-on bag currently down to 3 functional wheels, and I am Earth's 3rd official delegate to the Galactic Council of Allied Species. The first delegate wrote a very successful memoir. The second delegate stared at the sky a lot. I had 3 years ahead of me, a duffel bag and a protein bar I had been saving since the shuttle because I had eaten the shuttle's entire catering provision instead of conserving it, which tells you most of what you need to know about how I handle anticipation. Vel Station Orin, which translated roughly to the place where things are decided, had been built by the Council 40 years ago as neutral ground for all member species. Neutral was the operating principle behind everything on it. The hallways were slightly too wide for any one species to find fully comfortable. The lighting was calibrated for 11 different visual ranges at once, which meant everything existed in a constant soft pre-storm gray. The walls were an off-white that was trying its absolute best to offend no one. The floors were a very deliberate gray that belonged to no one in particular. Except for my tile, which was warmer. The welcome dinner was 3 hours after docking. 12 delegates. 12 species. One long table that curved at an angle I kept expecting to resolve if I looked at it from another direction. It never did. The food service was automated, which the orientation document explained with careful honesty was because no living being had ever been found capable of preparing a menu suitable for 11 biologies at once without something going seriously wrong for at least 2 of them. I had read this note on the shuttle and then eaten the shuttle's entire catering provision anyway, so I ate my protein bar at the table. 11 alien delegates watched me eat it with the focused attention of researchers observing the first trial of something that might explode. Gore, the delegate seated to my left, requires careful description. My xenolinguistics training included an entire module on not projecting threat onto physical form, and I took that module seriously. But Gore was approximately 7 feet of dense, layered chitin, with 4 arms arranged at angles that suggested evolution had been practical above all else. His species had the longest unbroken military record in Council history. His personal service record was summarized in my briefing document as see appendix. The appendix was 14 pages long. He looked at my protein bar. I broke off half and held it out to him. He took it. He turned it over in one broad claw, read both sides of the wrapper with great care, set the wrapper on the table, and then ate the entire thing, including a small piece of wrapper that had stuck to the end. Neither of us said a word. 3 delegates across the table were watching us with the expressions of people who had just witnessed something that did not fit any existing category and were in the process of deciding whether that was a problem. After dinner, Isath walked me to the threat assessment wing. He mentioned twice, without being asked, that this was not standard orientation procedure. That unprompted repetition told me it was absolutely standard and he simply wished it weren't. The threat register covered an entire wall, a live display recalculating in real time with 40 years of data beneath it. It had the feeling of something that had been updated every single day for 4 decades and was quietly proud of this fact. The THEC were listed at Tier 1. Military record unmatched in recorded Council history. The display note said, dominant active threat posture. I looked at Gore's entry and then at Gore across the room, who was still examining the protein bar wrapper. The Undinquire was at Tier 2. Collective consciousness. Hive distributed. The note said, sustained direct engagement not recommended. I asked Isath what that meant. He told me about a Veldry diplomat who had once spent 4 years believing he had already experienced every conversation before it occurred. I decided I would nod politely and move quickly if I ever encountered the choir. The Curith were at Tier 3. The entry said, long-term assessment only. No direct incidents. Observation ongoing. I asked what long-term meant. Isath went brown. In 300 years of council membership, he said carefully, the Curith have outlasted 4 founding member civilizations. They have never acted aggressively. They have simply continued to exist while others have not. The Curith delegate, whom I now saw seated at the far end of the dinner table, was small and very still, with hands folded. He had the particular quality of something that had learned a long time ago that it did not need to hurry. I read the rest of the register. 7 more entries. Weapons, numbers, biology, reach, memory. Threats with edges you could measure and prepare for. Then I found the entry above Tier 1. No tier number. No pronounceable species name. The translation chip rendered the identifier as unclassified. Ongoing. The silence, Isath said quietly. His voice had dropped in the specific way voices drop when a person is managing something. They arrived 40 years ago. They have maintained position at the edge of monitored space since then. They have not communicated. They have not made aggressive contact. They have not responded to any transmission from any council species. What have they done? I asked. They watch. His frills were a color I had no translation for. Something between gray and the feeling of a door opening behind you in an empty room. 3 council species sent long-range probes toward their position in the first decade of observation. 2 species received their probes back intact, cleaned, placed exactly at the boundary line with nothing attached. I waited. The 3rd species? I asked. He was silent for a long moment. The display cycled. The silence entry pulsed very gently above everything else on the register. I looked at it and thought, 40 years. 40 years of watching. 40 years of nothing at all. That is not what something looks like when it is building toward an attack. I knew what the build-up to something terrible felt like in your chest in the hours before it arrived. I knew it from close enough to still feel the shape of it years later. This was something else entirely. I kept that thought to myself. Back in my quarters, I sat on the edge of the bunk. Off-white walls. My carry-on leaning against the door at a slight angle on 3 wheels. I took the photograph from my jacket pocket and held it for a moment without looking directly at it, then tucked it back away. 3 moons outside the viewport, perfectly still in the dark. Somewhere past the edge of everything on that register, something was waiting. It had been waiting for 40 years. It was waiting right now while I sat in this off-white room and everyone else on the station went to sleep with their bones full of a fear they had carried so long it had begun to feel like furniture. I turned the light off. Slept fine. The silence vessel dropped out of transit at exactly 0600 station time. I know the exact time because it was the same moment my alarm went off, which meant the first sound I heard that morning was my alarm, and the second was the station-wide emergency signal. And for about 4 seconds, I was genuinely unable to determine which one required my more immediate attention. I grabbed my translation chip and walked into a hallway full of motion. Every delegation aide, every security officer, every staff member within range, everyone moving toward the council chamber with the barely controlled energy of people who had drilled for this situation and were now discovering that drills and the actual event feel absolutely nothing alike. The atmospheric processors were running higher than usual. The air had gone sharp and oddly clean, which I would later learn was the combined effect of 11 species fight responses hitting the ventilation system at once. I found the Earth delegation section in the chamber, 2 chairs and a plaque that still listed my predecessor's name, and sat down. The main display above the central floor showed the sensor feed. The vessel was enormous. I want to be careful with that word because people reach for it when they mean large and cannot find anything more specific. The silence vessel was not simply large. It occupied the sensor feed the way a mountain occupies a landscape, not as a feature of it but as a fact underneath it, something the display seemed to have been built around rather than something it was merely showing. It had the quality of having been present before the equipment observing it existed. And it was doing nothing. Just sitting there 2 light minutes from the station at the edge of monitored space. Cold. Dark. Absolutely still. The chamber had gone from orderly to barely contained in 20 minutes. 12 delegations speaking at once. Translation systems cycling in overlapping sequences. Aides moving between seats with data tablets. Voice levels climbing in the specific way they climb when everyone has something urgent to say and no one has the space to listen. Aviath, the Veldry Council chair, was an older diplomat whose frills had gone mostly white with age. He was calling for immediate defensive protocol in the measured tones of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment and was deeply unhappy to be living it. Then Gore stood up. When Gore stood up, the room refocused. Not because anyone was afraid of him, exactly. More the way a room refocuses when something very large, very old, and very experienced decides to become more visible. All council vessels to staging positions, he said in deep Thek, the translation rendering at a volume just slightly too loud for comfort. No engagement without full council vote. Defense posture only. This was genuinely the most reassuring thing I had heard since leaving Earth. The Kurith delegate, seated perfectly still as always, said nothing. His silence had weight, the way the silence of something very old and very patient tends to have weight. The undinquired delegate was generating a subsonic tone I could feel through the floor, which my training identified as a collective decision process in progress. I was eating a granola bar. I had found it at the bottom of my duffel bag that morning, somewhat crushed and slightly past its date. It was the most satisfying thing I had eaten in 6 days. I worked through it methodically while the chamber ran its collective panic in 12 distinct and culturally specific ways. A Veldry aide materialized at my elbow and stared at the granola bar. "What are you eating?" he asked. "A base nutrition block," I said. "Would you like some?" He looked at me the way you look at someone who has answered a question they were not asked in a language they did not ask for. Then he returned to his work. The proposals were coming in fast now. Evacuate non-essential personnel. Arm the perimeter satellites. Charge the defense array. Begin long-range mass analysis. Prepare for full engagement. A delegate from the Venth, a six-limbed species with a pronounced gift for formal rhetoric, wanted to know why the silence had chosen this particular moment after 40 years of stillness, and what specifically everyone intended to do about it. These were good questions. I finished the granola bar and folded the wrapper into a small square. I thought about the threat register. The entry above everything else. No tier number. No pronounceable name. 40 years of nothing behind it. They don't respond to transmissions. 6 years of xenolinguistics training. 32 communication systems across 14 species. My graduate thesis had been on the taxonomy of silence in contact situations. Which silences were absence, which were structural, which were chosen, and which were something else entirely. There is a kind of silence that is a doorway held open. I had written 40 pages on this concept. I had defended those pages before a faculty panel. I understood exactly what kind of silence I was looking at on that display. So I got up from my seat. The security officer near the aisle moved to intercept me. I showed him my delegate credential and cited the charter clause regarding freedom of movement during non-active emergency protocol periods. Defense posture was not active emergency protocol. Active emergency protocol required a full council vote, which had not yet been held. I had read the charter on the shuttle. He stepped back. The communications corridor was one level below the chamber, accessible through a maintenance stairwell that smelled like 3 kinds of coolant and had lighting that flickered at irregular intervals. The automated broadcast terminal at the far end had been designed for administrative station communications, not diplomatic use. I sat down. I opened a channel toward the last confirmed position of the silence vessel. "Hey," I said. "My name is Mara Voss. I'm Earth's delegate to the Galactic Council. I don't know if you receive on this frequency. I don't know if you communicate in any way I would recognize. But you've been parked out there for about 25 minutes now, and no one has said hello yet, and that seemed like something that should be corrected." Static. The specific wide texture of deep space static. Nothing like ordinary signal loss. Older than that. Wider. "I've been here less than a week," I said. "I'm not speaking for the council officially. I'm not authorized to be doing this. But if you've been out there for 40 years waiting for someone to start a conversation, I think you've waited long enough. And I'm sorry it took this long." I waited. The static did not change. Then something happened that I cannot describe cleanly in any language I know. It was not sound. It was not a transmission my equipment registered. Something arrived inside my head the way a memory arrives. Not heard. Not seen. Simply suddenly present. The sensation of something vast and very quiet leaning slightly forward after an extremely long period of stillness. The station temperature dropped 2 degrees in 30 seconds. Every sensor array on every monitoring deck registered the same new reading simultaneously. The silence vessel's outer hull, which had been reading as cold and completely inert since the moment it appeared, was warm. 3 security officers arrived at the terminal. They escorted me back upstairs with the polished efficiency of people who were genuinely angry but had been trained to demonstrate that through professionalism rather than direct expression. The chamber had gone quiet. On the display, the silence vessel had not moved a kilometer. Gore was standing. He was looking at me with the particular thorax stillness I was beginning to understand was not blankness, but the stillness of someone who had received new information and was giving it the consideration it deserved. Aviath's frills were entirely white and perfectly still. "The vessel's hull temperature," said an analyst on the lower floor, her voice very even, "is still rising." Nobody said anything. I looked at the folded granola bar wrapper in my left hand. The silence was warm. The formal hearing was held the next morning in a room slightly too small for its purpose, which I suspected was deliberate. The table was round. 12 delegates seated. One Mara Voss standing at the open end with a cup of coffee she had produced from the station's catering system by pressing 17 consecutive buttons in a sequence the system had clearly not anticipated anyone using. Aviath opened the proceedings by reading the charter clause I had cited to access the communications corridor. Then he read the clause immediately following it. The clause I had not read on the shuttle. That clause stipulated that freedom of movement during non-emergency periods did not extend to the use of official station broadcast systems for unauthorized diplomatic communication with unclassified contact entities. I looked at my coffee. I see, I said. The room was very quiet. Gore, seated to my right, placed a protein bar wrapper on the table. The wrapper from 2 days ago. He had kept it. I did not know what to do with that information, so I filed it away. The tribunal took 2 hours. They suspended my counsel access pending full review, effective immediately. The review period would require between 10 and 40 standard days. The charter was clear on the procedure. No vote required on the suspension itself. I nodded, thanked them for their time, picked up my coffee, and walked directly to the communications corridor. The security officer at the entrance looked at my delegate credentials, looked at his orders, looked at the distinction between counsel access suspension and station access suspension, which were technically different instruments under the charter, a distinction I had confirmed during the tribunal, and stepped aside. "Good morning," I said at the terminal toward the silence vessel. "I have been given a formal suspension. I am choosing to interpret this as free time." The hull temperature reading held steady. That, in its own way, was enough. It went on for 11 days. Every morning at the same time, I sat at the terminal and talked. I reported on the council proceedings, the ongoing debate about the defense array, the formal petition from 3 delegations requesting preemptive action, the counterproposal for extended observation. On day 3, I described the station's food processors in what I admit was excessive detail, because I had run out of diplomatic news. On day 4, I read a chapter from a novel on my tablet, a story about a person traveling somewhere they had never been, trying to understand people who had been there much longer than they had. On day 7, the silence vessel moved. Not toward the station. Not away from it. It shifted position by 300,000 kilometers, which in deep space terms was roughly equivalent to a person leaning slightly forward in a chair after a long period of sitting back. The council chamber spent 4 hours debating whether this constituted a hostile maneuver. I thought it constituted a lean. I kept that thought mostly to myself. Gore had begun appearing in the corridor while I made my morning transmissions. Not entering the room. Not speaking. Simply present, standing outside the open doorway with his arms folded and one large foot crossed over the other. On day 8, he arrived with a cup of the coffee I had offered him at the tribunal. He was drinking it. I said nothing. He said nothing. He stayed for the duration and then left. Day 9. Day 10. The Council Hardliner Coalition, now 4 delegations strong, filed a formal resolution to activate the primary weapons array. The resolution cited 40 years of threat assessment data, the unauthorized hull warming as a potential targeting indicator, and the ongoing failure of what the document carefully called the informal contact attempt to produce any verifiable diplomatic result. The Veldry chair held the vote in abeyance pending the outcome of my suspension review. The 2 proceedings were now formally linked. Neither could resolve without the other. I found this legally interesting. On day 11, I sat at the terminal, and the silence that came back was not static. Not the cold, wide texture of deep space at all. Something else. A voice? Or something close enough to a voice that the difference felt very small. Built from pieces. Fragments of council broadcasts and signal samples and intercepted transmissions assembled the way you build a language from pieces of other languages when you have been listening for a very long time and have never once been directly addressed. "You are not afraid," it said. I held very still. "I'm from Ohio," I said. "We process things differently there." A pause that felt less like signal delay and more like genuine consideration. "The ones before you," it said carefully, "they were afraid. We waited. We thought where there is fear, something important is present. Something that understands it exists in a universe with other things. We believed the fear would decrease in time. It did not." I set both hands flat on the console. "How long have you been waiting?" I asked, "for someone to just say hello?" There was no immediate answer. But when I checked the sensor feed after stepping away from the terminal, the hull temperature had climbed another 4 degrees. That afternoon, Aviath came to the corridor personally, accompanied by 2 officers. I was reinstated with a formal censure noted in the record and a verbal reminder about the broadcast clause, which I listened to carefully and acknowledged fully. The council was dividing on the weapons resolution. The hardliner coalition had gained a fourth delegation overnight. The motion was now one vote away from the majority required to pass. The vessel responded, I said. AVF replied, the vessel produced an anomalous transmission in a non-standard format that cannot be verified by our systems as intentional communication. This is not the same as a response. I looked at Gore. Gore was looking at the floor. It was a response, I said. Nobody said anything. The vote was scheduled for the following morning. I want to tell you about the night before the vote. I went back to my quarters and sat on the edge of the bunk and did not sleep. The 3 moons outside the viewport were very still. I took the photograph from my jacket pocket and set it on the shelf above the bunk, face out. I had kept it face down since Memphis. I did not know, sitting in that off-white room on a station at the edge of someone else's sphere, exactly why I was finally changing that. Maybe I just needed to look at something true. I was 8 years old when the Memphis collapse happened. That is what people call it now because it is a neutral phrase, and neutral words are what people use when the real words are too heavy to carry around in ordinary life. I was not there. My uncle was. Most of the people he worked with were. The ones who gave the order to act had been in a room far away, looking at reports, working from incomplete information, making a decision that seemed like the only reasonable one given what they knew and what they were afraid of. 700 people. The thing they had been afraid of was not what they thought it was. I had not explained this to the council in detail. I had said it once in one sentence at the tribunal and left it there. I would not be elaborating now. But I had thought about it every single day since arriving on the station, walking its compromised hallways, breathing its compromised air, watching 12 species who had collectively colonized 600 worlds sit in a room and tremble at something they had never once tried to speak to. The vote was at 0900. I arrived at 0842. The chamber was at capacity. All 12 delegations. Every senior aide. Every observer who had found a reason to be present. The hardliner coalition was seated together on one side in a formation that was not technically a formal block, but functioned exactly like one. 3 legal teams had been brought in specifically to document the result. AVF called the session to order. The motion before the council is Resolution 7 Alpha, he announced, authorization of defensive preemptive action against unclassified contact entity designation, silence. Full array activation pending council majority. They read the entire title. These things always take longer when the language is being careful about what it is doing. The Venth lead delegate spoke first. 6 limbs, excellent rhetoric, and a translation gap of about 30%. That was enough for me to catch the shape of the argument without all its decoration. The shape was this. We do not know what this is. We do not know what it wants. 40 years of unknown is 40 years too long. We have weapons. The correct moment to use them is before the moment when we no longer can. 3 more speakers followed with variations on the same foundation. Unknown threat posture. Preemptive action. The framework underneath every speech was identical. The silence cannot be understood, and things that cannot be understood cannot be trusted, and things that cannot be trusted should be removed before they become a problem that cannot be removed. I looked at the display above the central floor. The silence vessel had not moved since its 300,000-kilometer lean on day 7. It was still warm. Gore had not spoken. He was seated, both sets of arms resting on his chair's armrests, watching the chamber with the patience of something that had attended many debates and understood that the conclusion was usually constructed before the debate formally began. AVF asked if any remaining delegates wished to speak before the vote was called. I stood up. I am not entirely certain whether I decided to stand or whether my body made that decision and informed me about it afterward. Either way, I was on my feet and the chamber was looking at me, and I had the specific feeling of someone who has stepped onto something that may or may not hold their weight and has already passed the point of reconsidering. I was 8 years old, I said, when my uncle and 693 other people died because the people with the authority to act on incomplete information decided that the thing they did not understand was a threat and acted on that decision. The chamber went very quiet. I'm not asking you to trust the silence. I'm not asking you to believe they are harmless. I paused. I am asking you to look at what has actually happened in the past 11 days. Something that did not respond to 40 years of council transmissions responded to a person sitting alone at a terminal saying hello. It responded warmly, literally warmly. If this is what the silence looks like when it has decided to be hostile, then we are working with a definition of hostile that I do not recognize. The Venth delegate began to reply. I sat down. The room remained quiet for a few more seconds. Then the vote began. The hardliner coalition, 4 in favor. 3 fence-sitting delegations fell toward them. 7 votes in favor. Majority required, 7. The Thek delegation voted against. The Kurith delegate remained still for a long moment and then voted against. The Undin choir, After a collective process that took approximately 90 seconds and sounded like the floor itself was making a decision, voted against. 6 against. 7 in favor. Aviath was preparing to announce the result when the door to the weapons control wing opened. An aide crossed the central floor and handed a message to the chair's podium. Aviath read it. His frills went the white of something very old and very still. The primary weapons array, he said slowly, has been locked. Pause. Someone has physically occupied the primary control station and engaged the manual override locks from the inside. Another pause. The station log identifies that individual as Delegate Voss. It was me in the present tense. I had not been in my chair for the entire session. I had been seated for the first 6 speakers. Then I had walked to the facility corridor, taken the maintenance sub-level route to the weapons control station, and engaged the manual override locks from inside approximately 11 minutes before I stood up to address the chamber. The speech had been the second half of the plan. I pressed the intercom from inside the locked room. You can open this door, I said. There is no lock on this station. I could engage that your security team cannot disengage given enough time and proper authorization. I understand this fully. I am not attempting to stop you permanently. I am attempting to give you 11 additional minutes in which to make a different decision, which is approximately how long your team will need to disengage this lock through standard protocol. The chamber was completely silent. Then Gore's voice came through the intercom. Delegate Voss. Yes. Security has been given authorization. I know, I said. I've been watching them on the room monitor. They are very efficient. About 9 minutes now, I'd estimate. Pause. Then Gore asked, what do you want us to look at? The hull temperature data, I said. Specifically the rate of change since day 1 of contact, and the thermal signature readings from the probe returns 40 years ago. The probes that came back clean and intact. Silence on the intercom. The humming kind. They cleaned those probes, I said. They warmed them. They returned them to the exact boundary position. They did not damage them. They did not use them as a message of warning. They sent them back in better condition than they arrived. 7 minutes on the security estimate. That is not the behavior of something preparing to destroy you, I said. That is the behavior of something that knows you are there, has decided not to hurt you, and is waiting for you to understand that and respond in kind. 5 minutes. I grew up understanding what it feels like to be on the wrong side of a decision made by frightened people with authority, I said. I am asking you directly and clearly not to be those people today. The intercom was quiet for a moment. Then Gore said, the hull temperature? Yes. It has increased 14 degrees since your first transmission. He paused. It increased another 2 degrees during your speech to the chamber. I sat with that for a moment. Yes, I said. The security team disengaged the lock at the 8-minute mark. They were ahead of schedule and very good at their jobs. 2 officers walked me back to the chamber with professional courtesy and no conversation. The vote was not called again that morning. Aviath adjourned the session pending formal review of the sensor data I had referenced. Official record. Binding analysis. Full documentation. The weapons array remained inactive. I walked back to my seat. Gore was already there standing beside my chair. He set the protein bar wrapper on my armrest, placing it there with the careful deliberateness of something that deserved to be set down carefully. Then he went back to his own seat. I sat down. My hands were not shaking. They were a little. 3 weeks later the station smelled different. Not worse. Not better. Just new. A different note beneath the usual compromise of 11 atmospheric processors doing their collective best. The ventilation system had been recalibrated overnight. The station log entry read, atmospheric profile expansion. Accommodation of 13th environmental signature. Adjustment period estimated 4 to 6 days. I stood in the corridor that first morning and just breathed for a moment. Then I went and got coffee. The formal sensor analysis had taken 11 days. The Council's scientific team, working alongside 2 external experts from the Veldry Research Institute, produced a report of 412 pages concluding that the hull temperature readings were consistent with intentional biological, or analogous, response to external stimuli and not consistent with any known mechanical or environmental explanation. 412 pages to say it was responding to her. The Hardliner Coalition challenged the report on technical grounds. The challenge required a counter-analysis. The counter-analysis took 6 more days and reached the same conclusion more firmly. The weapons resolution was not reintroduced. I had not expected it would be. I had watched enough rooms change shape once the argument underneath them got named clearly enough in public. The motion to fire had never genuinely been about the silence. It had been about 40 years of accumulated fear with nowhere productive to go. Once you expose that clearly enough on the record, the motion loses its architecture. It becomes what it actually was, and no one wants to cast a formal vote for that. The formal contact process had begun on day 17. Slowly. It would be slow for a long time. The silence communicated in a way that did not map neatly onto any existing translation framework, and the teams building the interface were doing the kind of meticulous, patient work that would take years to fully resolve. But it was working. Not perfectly. Not at a speed that satisfied the delegations who preferred resolution to arrive on a schedule, but working in the direction it needed to. I had continued the morning transmissions throughout. The silence seemed to prefer the informal daily contact to the structured official sessions. The official sessions produced technical data. The morning transmissions produced warmth, consistent, steady, measurable warmth. Over those weeks I learned things. The silence were archivists, roughly. That was the nearest concept I could locate in any existing cultural framework. They traveled. They observed. They recorded. Their contact protocol required the other party to initiate, not from hierarchy or aggression, but because their entire cultural framework around consent was built on the principle that you did not speak to something until it had first indicated that it wished to be spoken to. They had been waiting for 40 years for someone to indicate this. 3 council species had attempted formal transmissions during those decades. All 3 had used the standard council contact framework, which was designed to be received by species with similar communication architecture. The silence received it and could not parse it as invitation. To them it looked like sound, activity, motion. Not an open door. The probes they returned, cleaned and warmed, were, in their culture, the equivalent of a lit window. A gesture of welcome. A signal that the space was safe to enter if the other party chose to do so. None of the council species had read this as invitation. They had read it as something to fear. When I presented this to the council in a formal report with full supporting analysis, the chamber was quiet for a long time. Aviath said, "We return no such gesture." "No," I said. "You didn't." The Kurith delegate spoke. This was unusual enough that the room refocused entirely. "What," he asked, "was their interpretation of our silence during those 40 years? I looked at him. "They thought you were considering their offer," I said. "They thought you were taking time to make a careful, considered decision about whether you wanted contact, and that their role was to wait patiently while you did." The Kurith delegate was still for a moment. "That," he said quietly, "is what we thought about them." The room took this in. 2 parties. 40 years. Each convinced the other was in the middle of saying something important and simply taking a very long time to say it. I sat back in my chair. Hell of a thing. The new title came 2 days after the formal report. Aviath presented it at the opening of the morning session, which was unusual because administrative matters were normally handled at the close. Opening with it meant it had been discussed and agreed upon before the session began, which meant it had required a longer conversation than usual, which meant it was not entirely uncontroversial even among the people who voted for it. The council had voted 12 in favor, 0 opposed to create a new permanent position. Human liaison for unclassified contact situations. The remit was specific: to be present at the initial contact stage of any encounter with a species that had been classified as a potential threat before any formal diplomatic or military response was initiated. The charter language said, "This position exists in recognition of the demonstrated value of informal, non-hierarchical initial contact in situations where standard protocol has produced escalatory rather than communicative outcomes." 400 words to say. Sometimes it helps to just say hello first. I accepted the position. I asked whether it came with an improved food allocation. It did not. I asked whether the supply office could at least replace my carry-on bag, which was now down to 2 functional wheels. They said they would look into it. The morning after the announcement, I found Gore in the commissary. He had a tray in front of him with something on it I could not identify, but which smelled acceptable. He set a protein bar on the table and pushed it toward me. It was one of the ones I had given him. He had kept it for 3 weeks and was now returning it. I looked at it. "My people have fought 43 wars, he said. "We have a word for the kind of person who walks into a room that everyone else has decided is dangerous and simply declines to find it dangerous." He paused. "The word translates roughly as someone who has already made peace with the worst outcome and therefore cannot be moved by the threat of it." I turned the protein bar over in my hands. "I wasn't fearless," I said. "I was just more afraid of the other option." He looked at me for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That is what the word means." We sat in the commissary while it filled slowly around us with the ordinary business of the station. Analysts, aides, conversation, and the low hum of 11 atmospheric processors doing their work. Neither of us said anything else. It was enough. I ate the protein bar. That afternoon, the silence gave its first formal address to the full council. Every delegation at capacity. Every senior staff member present. Every observer who had found a reason to be in the building. The display above the central floor showed the Silence vessel, its hull running at the highest steady temperature since first contact. Warm in the sensor feed like something that had been cold for a very long time and had finally found a reason to stop. The address came through the translation interface assembled over the previous weeks. Imperfect, built from pieces of council languages the Silence had been listening to for 40 years. Hearing it was like hearing someone speak in a language learned entirely from recordings. The vocabulary was good. The idiom occasionally arrived slightly sideways from its intention. And underneath both of those things was something else. Something that felt, even through the translation system, like a presence that had been patient for a very long time and was now carefully beginning to speak. The Silence began by describing themselves. Archivists as I had understood. Observers. A species with a lifespan that made the Council's concept of patience look like impatience. 3 centuries of traveling, watching, recording. More than 200 civilizations in their records. And in 3 centuries, they had never once initiated direct contact themselves, because their entire understanding of respect required that the other party signal readiness first. We did not understand, the Silence said, that your silence could mean fear. In our experience, silence always means consideration. We waited for consideration to become a decision. The chamber held this. We have observed, the Silence continued, that many species respond to unknown contact by preparing for conflict. We have seen this before. We waited. Usually, after a period of preparation, a species will pause. They will recognize that preparation has not resolved the unknown. They will try something else. A pause in which the room was completely still. Many do not try something else, the Silence said. They wait for fear to instruct them. Fear does not give good instruction. Aviatha's frills were very still. You said, he asked, the Silence tried something else here? The translation interface did the work it needed to do. The Silence had a classification system. 3 centuries. 200 species. Every one of them categorized. Most fell into one of 2 groups. The first translated roughly as those who reach, species that moved toward the unknown, extended themselves outward, sought contact as a matter of instinct. The second translated as those who flinch, species that contracted when something unfamiliar appeared, that moved toward weapons and walls and the management of what they could not explain. Both were understood. Both were, in the Silence's framework, reasonable responses to existing in a universe full of things you had not yet encountered. But in 300 years across 200 civilizations, they had encountered one species that fit neither category. A species that, when faced with something large and unknown and frightening, did not reach and did not flinch. A species that sat down. A species that made noise in the quiet, not because it had no fear but because it had decided the noise was more important than the fear. The translation team had spent 40 minutes attempting to render the Silence's word for this into any existing council language. The closest they could get was kin. The chamber was silent for a long time after that. I was eating a protein bar. The Curith delegate, who had spoken perhaps 5 full sentences in all the time I had been on the station, looked across the room at me. I gave him a small nod. He gave me a small nod back. That evening I returned to my quarters. Off-white walls. My carry-on by the door, now down to 2 wheels and leaning at a more pronounced angle than before. 3 moons outside the viewport, steady in the dark. I sat on the edge of the bunk. I took the photograph from the shelf where I had placed it face out 3 weeks earlier and held it for a long time. The people in it were long gone. 700 of them and some. The ones who had been in the wrong place when someone with authority and incomplete information and a great deal of fear made an irreversible decision in a room far away, working from reports, acting on what felt like the only available option. I had carried them folded in my pocket for 6 years. I was not making peace with what had happened to them. I was not finding meaning in it or arriving at some place of resolution. There is no resolution that fits inside the space a loss like that carves out. You just learn to carry the shape of it without letting it make all your decisions. But I had been in a room where that same decision was about to be made again. In a different building. About a different thing. With different people holding the authority. And the decision had been different. That was what I had. That was the thing I could point to. It was not enough. It would never be entirely enough. But it was what there was. I set the photograph back on the shelf, face out. The air in the room had that new note in it now, the 13th atmospheric signature. Something that had been outside for 40 years and was now very slowly learning what it meant to be inside. Not at home yet. Not familiar. But present. Breathing the same air as everything else on the station. Warming it a little. I turned the light off. Slept fine.